Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let the weight of your day sink into whatever is holding you right now. The mattress, the couch, the seat of a car that isn't moving anymore. You don't need to do anything for the next few hours except listen and drift and let your mind wander somewhere far older than tonight. Tonight, we're going back almost 2,500 years to a world of sun bleached stone and olive groves, of narrow streets and painted pottery, of gods who live just behind the curtain of everyday life. We're going to spend the night inside the world of Greek women, not the queens and priestesses whose names made it into the history books, but the wives, daughters, weavers, and mothers whose entire lives played out in rooms most history forgot to look inside. Before we go there, two small things. If you're enjoying this kind of slow, immersive history, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep making these long, quiet videos, and it costs you nothing but a tap. And if you're still awake enough to type, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. There's something quietly wonderful about a video like this. People falling asleep to the same story in a dozen different time zones, all at once, all somewhere else in the dark. Now get comfortable. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. And let's go back to a world where a woman's front door was the edge of everything men were allowed to see, and the beginning of everything they weren't. Picture a house in Athens in the 5th century BCE. From the street, it gives you almost nothing. A blank wall of sun-dried mud brick, a single wooden door, no windows facing outward, because in this city, a house isn't built to look nice from the outside. It's built to keep the outside out. Step through that door, though, and everything changes. The house opens inward around a small courtyard open to the sky, and it's here that the entire rhythm of a family's life unfolds, hidden from anyone passing by. If you were a citizen's wife in this house, you would spend most of your waking life in a section of it called the gynekonitis, the women's quarters. Usually it was upstairs or tucked toward the back, away from the andron, the room where the men of the household entertained guests with wine and conversation late into the night. The division wasn't just architectural, it was the physical expression of an idea that shaped almost everything about a woman's life in classical Greece, that a respectable woman's place was inside, unseen, her name spoken by strangers, as rarely as possible. This is the part of the story most documentaries stop at. Woman, house, invisible, end of segment. But if that were the whole truth, this would be a very short and very boring video, and it wouldn't explain the thousands of vase paintings, the letters, the court cases, the medical texts, and the archaeological digs that show something far stranger and more complicated going on behind that blank street wall. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. That same house you were confined to was also a factory, a temple, a nursery, a hospital, a bank, and a stage, and you were running all of it. Think about what actually happened inside those walls on an average day. Wool arrived raw, greasy, and full of thorns, and by the end of a long stretch of days, it left the house as finished cloth, sometimes fine enough to be sold, sometimes destined to clothe an entire family for a year. Grain came in as sacks of hard kernels and left as bread, porridge, and cakes for festivals. Herbs picked from a small courtyard garden became medicine for a sick child, a treatment for a husband's fever, a salve for a birth gone difficult. None of this ran itself. It ran because a woman, or more precisely, because you, planned it, scheduled it, delegated it to slaves and daughters, checked it, and answered for it if it failed. The word the Greeks used for this role tells you more than any modern label could. She was called the Kyria, a word related to Kyrios, lord or master, the lady of the house. Inside those walls, she held an authority that had almost nothing to do with how the world outside perceived her. Xenophon, writing a guide for how a young bride should manage her household, describes the wife as a kind of indoor general, responsible for provisions, for organizing the slaves, for knowing where every single object in the house was kept, because a household that couldn't produce what it needed when it needed it wasn't a household men could rely on for anything else. So try to sit with the contradiction for a moment, because it's the contradiction the rest of tonight's story will keep circling back to. Outside the house, you were close to invisible. Your name wasn't supposed to be spoken by men who weren't your relatives. If you appeared in public at all, ideally it was for a funeral, a wedding, or a religious festival, moments the city itself sanctioned. But inside the house, you were the one who kept everyone alive. You decided which slave worked the loom and which one ground the grain. You decided how the stored oil was rationed across a long winter. If your husband was called away to war, and in a city almost constantly at war with someone, he often was, the entire operation of the household fell to you, sometimes for years at a stretch, with no one checking your decisions except the gods and your own judgment. There's a detail from the philosopher Aristotle that captures this strange split perfectly. He described the ideal household as having two rulers, the husband governing political matters, meaning anything connected to public life, and the wife governing the interior, not as a subordinate exactly, but as the head of a separate domain that he, frankly, didn't fully understand and mostly didn't need to. Men in this world often had only a hazy sense of what actually happened inside their own homes during the day. They knew wool went in and clothing came out. They rarely asked how. Even the architecture hints at how seriously this division was taken and how much trust it actually required. Excavations of Athenian houses from this period show that the women's quarters were sometimes positioned with their own separate access to the courtyard, their own storage rooms, occasionally even a second small entrance that let women move between rooms without crossing paths with male guests in the andron. This wasn't a cage built to trap someone incompetent. It was infrastructure built around someone the household depended on completely, designed to protect her reputation, and by extension the whole family's honor, from the mere fact of being seen. And reputation was not a small thing. In classical Athens, a woman's good name functioned almost like currency. A wife's virtue reflected directly on her husband's standing among other citizens, on her children's prospects for good marriages, on the family's ability to move through public religious and political life without whispered scandal. This is part of why the seclusion existed at all, not because anyone believed women were incapable of navigating the world outside, but because a woman's visibility was treated as a kind of risk, one the household could not always afford to take. Which raises an obvious question: one worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep tonight. If a woman's entire influence was supposed to stop at her own front door, why do we find, again and again, evidence of women who clearly didn't stay behind it, who ran market stalls, who worked as wet nurses and midwives in other households, who walked to public fountains every single day, who organized entire religious festivals that men were legally forbidden to attend? The seclusion of Greek women wasn't a wall, it was a permeable membrane, thinner in some places than others, and almost invisible if you were poor. Because here's something the philosophers rarely bothered to mention. Everything we just described, the enclosed courtyard, the private women's quarters, the fiction of total invisibility, described the life of a citizen's wife in a wealthy or comfortably middling household. It described maybe a slice of the population. For the vast majority of women in the ancient Greek world, seclusion wasn't even an option because there was no household staff to send to the market instead of you, no slave to fetch the water, no one to mind the stall while you stayed decorously out of sight. Poor women worked. They sold vegetables, wove for wages, nursed other people's children, gleaned fields after harvest, hawked ribbons and perfume in the agora under the open sky, in full view of any man who cared to look. So as we move deeper into this house tonight, keep both of these women in your mind at once. The wealthy Kyria, upstairs in her quiet gyneconitis, invisible by design, and quietly running an entire economy of thread and grain and medicine, and the woman in the street below her window, visible by necessity, carrying water or selling bread because her family had no other choice. Between them is almost the whole truth of what it meant to be a woman in ancient Greece, a life built at every level of society around work that history barely bothered to record. Let's go looking for it anyway. If there is one object that defined a Greek woman's day more than any other, it wasn't a broom or a cooking pot or even a cradle. It was the loom. Imagine waking before the sun in your Athenian house. The air in the courtyard is still cool, gray with the last of the night. Somewhere a rooster is starting up, and already, before bread is baked or water fetched, the household's upright loom stands waiting against the wall of the women's quarters, strung with the previous day's unfinished work, heavy stone or clay weights hanging along the bottom edge to keep the threads taut through the night. Woolworking wasn't a hobby. It wasn't something a Greek woman did to pass idle hours, the way later centuries liked to imagine genteel ladies embroidering by a window. It was one of the most economically critical forms of labor in the entire household, and everyone from the poorest laborer's wife to Penelope herself, waiting 20 years for Odysseus at her own loom, was measured in part by how well she did it. Start at the beginning, because the beginning was brutal. Raw wool didn't arrive soft and clean. It arrived greasy with lanolin, matted with dirt, tangled with thorns and burrs from the pasture. Before a single thread could be spun, that wool had to be washed, often in stale urine, which was genuinely one of the most effective degreasing agents available in the ancient world, then rinsed and rinsed again. It had to be picked apart by hand to remove debris, a slow, monotonous task that could occupy an entire morning for a single day's work of spinning. Then it was carded, combed out between two spiked paddles until the fibers all lay in the same direction, transforming a tangled clump into something that could actually be drawn into thread. Only then did the spinning begin, and this is the part that most people picture when they imagine ancient women at work. A woman standing or seated, a distaff holding a bundle of prepared wool tucked under one arm, her fingers drawing out a continuous strand, while a small weighted spindle dropped and spun below her hand, twisting the fiber into thread as it fell. It looks almost meditative from the outside, and maybe some days it was. But a woman spinning enough thread to keep a household loom fed with material was doing math with her hands, judging thickness, tension, and twist by feel, correcting mistakes before they became knots that would ruin an entire piece of cloth days later. And then finally, weaving itself, hours at the standing loom, working the weft thread back and forth through the vertical warp threads, beating each new row tight with a wooden or bone tool before starting the next. A simple cloak might take days. A large, finely patterned piece, the kind gifted to a temple or woven for a wedding or dedicated to a goddess, could take months of accumulated hours, worked in whatever windows of daylight and lamplight a woman could spare between every other task in the household. Here is the detail that changes how you should think about all of this. Cloth produced inside a Greek household wasn't just clothing, it was wealth. A family's stored textiles functioned almost like a bank account, durable, valuable, tradable, storable for years without spoiling the way food would. A skilled weaver added real, calculable value to her household's economy every single day she sat at the loom, and everyone in the house knew it. This is part of why woolworking shows up constantly in Greeks' funerary monuments, gravestones for women, sometimes even wealthy women who technically didn't need to work, frequently show a wool basket sitting beside the deceased or depict her seated with a spindle in hand. It wasn't an insult. It was the highest compliment a family could carve in stone. She worked, she produced, she was industrious. The word the Greeks used, philergos, literally work-loving, appears again and again on tombstones as a term of genuine praise, right alongside devotion to husband and children. There's a myth that captures how seriously this labor was taken as a marker of worth, and it isn't the myth you'd expect. Most people know the story of Penelope, unweaving her burial shroud each night to stall her suitors, proof, even in myth, that the loom was where a clever woman could quietly outmaneuver men who thought they had already won. Fewer people know the story of Arachne, the mortal weaver so skilled that she dared to claim her work rivaled the goddess Athena's own. In the version most often told, Athena challenged her to a contest, and Arachne's tapestry, depicting the gods behaving badly, arrogantly, even cruelly toward mortals, was by the story's own admission flawless, perfect, impossible to fault. She lost anyway, transformed into a spider for the crime of pride, not skill. Sit with that for a second. Even in a myth designed to punish a woman for arrogance, the Greeks couldn't bring themselves to say her weaving was anything less than the equal of a goddess's. That's how much the craft mattered. At the very top of Athenian civic life, this domestic labor scaled up into something genuinely extraordinary. Every 4 years, the city celebrated the Great Panathenaea, its most important religious festival, honoring Athena as protector of the city. And at the center of that festival was a single object, the peplos, an enormous new robe woven specifically as a gift for the ancient wooden statue of the goddess housed on the Acropolis. This wasn't made by professional male craftsmen, it was woven by women, a small group of specially selected girls called the Araforoi, who began the work under supervision roughly 9 months before the festival, working alongside more experienced women, weaving scenes from the mythical battle between the gods and the giants directly into the fabric. When the finished peplos was finally carried through the city in procession, hoisted like a sail on a wheeled ship cart as part of the celebration, it represented hundreds of hours of purely female labor on public display, celebrated by the entire city, dedicated to the goddess who, fittingly, was herself a patron of weaving. So when you picture a Greek woman bent over her loom in the gray hour before dawn, don't picture idleness and don't picture punishment. Picture someone running a small, continuous production line that clothed her family, added measurable value to her household's wealth, and, for the most skilled, connected her thread by thread to a tradition the entire city turned out to honor once every 4 years. The loom wasn't where she was hidden away. In a strange way, it was where she was most visibly herself, even if almost no man outside her own household ever saw her sitting there. There was one errand that pulled almost every woman in the city out of her house on a near daily basis, regardless of how wealthy her family was or how strictly her household observed the rules of seclusion, and that errand was water. Most Greek houses of this period didn't have private plumbing. A family might have a well or a cistern for basic needs, but for water considered clean enough for cooking and especially for drinking, women walked, often every single day, sometimes twice, to the public fountain house. In Athens, the most famous of these was the Enniakrounos, the nine-spouted fountain, built under the tyrant Pisistratos, specifically to give the city a reliable, monumental source of clean water. And if you were a woman in this city, that fountain house was very possibly the single most important social space in your entire life. Picture the walk itself. You'd take up your water jar, a hydria, with its distinctive 3 handles, 2 for lifting and 1 for pouring, designed to be carried on the head or against the hip once full. You'd walk out through your street, past the blank walls of other houses just like your own, toward the covered structure where water ran continuously from carved stone spouts, usually shaped like lion or animal heads, into a shared basin below. And there you would find other women, lots of them. This is one of the great, quiet ironies of ancient Athenian life. A city that built its entire domestic architecture around the principle that respectable women should not be seen in public also built, right at its civic center, one of the only spaces where women were expected to gather day after day in full public view for as long as it took to fill their jars. And they did not fill those jars in silence. Vase paintings from this period, of which there are dozens surviving today, show women at the fountain house not rushing through a chore but lingering, chatting in small groups, adjusting each other's hair, gesturing mid conversation, sometimes clearly gossiping if the painted expressions are any guide. The fountain house shows up often enough in comic plays and in vase decoration that historians now generally agree it functioned as something close to a women's news network for the entire city, the place where you learned who was getting married, whose husband had come home wounded from the latest campaign, which household's slave girl had run off, what the priestess at which temple had said about the omens for the coming month. Think about what that actually meant for someone living inside the walls of your own courtyard for most of the week. The fountain house wasn't a chore you dreaded. It may well have been the best part of your day, one of the very few windows of time when you weren't answering to your husband, your mother in law, or the running list of tasks waiting back at the loom. For a young bride, newly married into a household of strangers, possibly in a part of the city she barely knew, the walk to the fountain and the conversations that happened there might have been her first real chance to build a social world of her own, separate from her husband's family. Not everyone approved of this, and that disapproval tells you a great deal. Solon, the Athenian lawmaker credited with major reforms in the early 6th century BCE, is said to have restricted the amount of food and possessions women could carry when traveling to and from funerals, part of a broader set of laws aimed at reining in what male authorities saw as excessive, disorderly, overly visible female behavior in public contexts. Later, comic playwrights leaned hard into the stereotype of women at the fountain house as gossips and time wasters, milking the joke of a wife who claimed to be fetching water but somehow took most of the morning to do it. Comedy exaggerates for laughs, but comedy also only works if the audience recognizes the shape of the thing being mocked. The joke about women lingering at the fountain landed because everyone in the audience, male and female, knew it was true. There's something worth noticing in how differently water fetching was treated depending on who was doing it. For a slave woman or a poor citizen's wife, the daily walk to the fountain was unglamorous, physically demanding labor. A full hydria of water is heavy, and the trip might be made more than once a day in the heat of an Athenian summer. But even for these women, the fountain house offered something rare, a legitimate reason to be out of the house, in public, talking to people outside their own household, entirely sanctioned by custom. Unlike almost any other public activity, no husband could reasonably object to his wife fetching water because the household genuinely needed it. It was, in a strange way, one of the few loopholes built directly into the architecture of daily life. Some historians have gone as far as calling the fountain house one of the earliest recognizable women's spaces in Western history, not a temple, not a formal institution, nothing anyone would have thought to name or legislate, but a functioning social infrastructure that women built for themselves inside the cracks of a system designed to keep them apart from public life. Marriages were arranged there, informally, through gossip about who was looking for a match. Reputations were made and unmade in the time it took to fill a jar. Political news, which women could not vote on, could not speak about in the assembly, could not influence through any formal channel, nonetheless moved through the fountain house at remarkable speed, carried by women who then brought it home to their husbands, whether the husbands realized where the information had actually come from or not. So the next time you picture a secluded Greek wife, picture her not only at her loom, but making that walk, jar balanced against her hip, sandals scuffing the dust of an Athenian street, heading toward the one place in the city where being a woman in public wasn't a scandal, but simply Tuesday. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of detail that quietly dismantles the flatter version of this story. The version where Greek women simply stayed inside, invisible, until they died. The truth is messier and much more human. They found the gaps. They walked through them daily, jar on hip, water sloshing, gossip trading hands faster than the water itself. There is a room in every ancient Greek house that almost never gets talked about, and it might have mattered more than any other room in the building. It didn't have a name as grand as the Andron, and no philosopher wrote treatises praising its importance. It was the storeroom, and if you were the Kyria of your household, its key never left your side, literally. Married Greek women in this period are frequently depicted in art and described in texts as carrying a set of keys, sometimes on a cord around the waist, sometimes tucked into clothing, granting access to the storerooms where grain, oil, wine, cloth, and household valuables were kept. This wasn't a decorative accessory. It was one of the clearest physical symbols of the authority a wife held inside her own home, and handing over that key at marriage, from mother to new bride, or from the outgoing housekeeper to the incoming wife, was itself a small ceremony of transferred trust. Whoever held the key controlled the household's survival, day to day, season to season. Consider what that actually required of you. A Greek household didn't run to a market for fresh supplies every afternoon the way a modern household might. Food had to be stored to last, sometimes for an entire year, sometimes across multiple years in case of a bad harvest. And this was a city that experienced bad harvests, sieges, and disrupted trade with genuine life threatening regularity. Grain had to be kept dry and protected from mice and weevils. Olive oil, which functioned as fuel for lamps as much as it did as food, had to be rationed carefully enough to last through a dark winter without running out, but not so carefully that the household went without light. Wine needed to be watched for spoilage. Cheese, dried fruit, preserved olives, salted fish, all of it needed to be tracked, portioned, and doled out, with an eye on both the current week's needs and the uncertain months still ahead. This is, in the most literal sense possible, a logistics job. You are forecasting demand, managing inventory, allocating scarce resources across dozens of dependents, children, slaves, elderly relatives, sometimes hired laborers during harvest season, and you are doing it with no written household accounting system to fall back on, no calendar app, nothing but memory, judgment, and the physical evidence of how full or empty each storage jar had become. Xenophon's household guide, again, is unusually blunt about how much this mattered. He describes an ideal wife, organizing the storeroom so meticulously that any object requested by anyone in the household at any time could be located instantly, because a household where things went missing, spoiled, or ran out unexpectedly reflected badly on everyone, starting with her. And this is where the kitchen itself comes in, because cooking in a Greek household wasn't a simple matter of preparing whatever ingredients happened to be on hand. Bread was the daily staple, and making it was hard, physical, unglamorous labor, grinding grain by hand between stone querns, a task so repetitive and demanding that wealthier households delegated it entirely to slaves, while poorer women did it themselves, day after day, their forearms and shoulders permanently strengthened by the motion. The dough was kneaded, shaped, and baked, either in a small domestic oven or, in many households, sent out to be baked communally, since not every house had the equipment or the fuel to spare for daily baking. Beyond bread, meals in a typical household centered on barley porridge, vegetables from a small kitchen garden, olives, cheese, and, for most families, most of the time, very little meat, which was expensive and often reserved for festival days when it was distributed after public sacrifices. Herbs mattered enormously, both for flavor and for the fact that the line between cooking and medicine barely existed in the ancient world. The same woman managing the storeroom's oregano, thyme, and garlic for the evening meal was also the household's first line of defense against illness, using many of those same plants, plus others cultivated specifically for their medicinal properties, to treat fevers, stomach complaints, wounds, and the countless small emergencies of daily life long before anyone considered calling a physician, if a physician was even available or affordable. There's a particular kind of pressure worth sitting with here, one that rarely makes it into popular retellings of ancient history. Running a household in this world wasn't a passive domestic role. It was closer to running a small, precarious business with no safety net, where a single miscalculation about how much grain to save for winter could mean real hunger by spring. Athens imported a significant portion of its grain by sea, which meant supply could be disrupted by war, piracy, or bad weather with almost no warning. During the long, grinding Peloponnesian War against Sparta, which dragged on for the better part of 3 decades, households across Athens faced exactly this kind of uncertainty repeatedly, and it was the woman holding the storeroom key who had to decide, week after week, how to stretch what remained. Slaves complicated and supported this work in equal measure. A household of even modest means typically included enslaved women who handled much of the heaviest, most repetitive labor, grinding grain, hauling water, tending the fire, under the direction of the Kyria, who was responsible for organizing their tasks, checking their work, and, in the language of the surviving sources, essentially managing a small domestic workforce. This is an uncomfortable thread running through almost every part of Greek women's history, and it's worth naming plainly rather than glossing over. The relative freedom and authority a citizen wife held inside her own household was built in large part on the unfree labor of other women who held no authority at all, and whose own stories survive in almost no detail whatsoever. When we talk about the sophistication of Greek household management, we are very often talking about a system of delegated authority that rested on the backs of people the historical record barely bothered to name. So think of the storeroom key hanging quietly at a woman's waist as one of the most loaded objects in the entire ancient Greek house, a small piece of bronze or iron that represented forecasting, rationing, medicine, labor management, and the literal survival of everyone under that roof, all resting in the hands of someone the city outside would have described, without a flicker of irony, as having no real responsibilities at all. Before the sun had fully cleared the courtyard wall, before the loom was strung and the bread was set to rise, there was often one more task waiting, quieter than the others and in its own way just as essential. The household hearth had to be tended, and the gods who watched over it had to be honored. At the center of nearly every Greek house stood a hearth, sacred to Hestia, goddess of the home and of the fire, that never should be allowed to fully die out. Keeping that fire alive wasn't just a practical matter of not having to relight it from scratch each morning, though that mattered too, since fire starting without matches was slow, difficult work. It carried genuine religious weight. A hearth fire that went cold was treated as an unsettling omen, a sign that something in the household's relationship with the divine had gone quietly wrong, and the woman responsible for the hearth's upkeep was by extension responsible for the spiritual continuity of the entire family. This is worth pausing on because it points to something easy to miss in a story so often told through the lens of exclusion. While Greek women were barred from formal political religion, they could not serve as priests of most major civic cults, could not vote in the assembly on matters of religious law, could not hold most of the offices tied to a city's official relationship with the gods. The household itself was saturated with religious responsibilities that fell almost entirely to them. Domestic religion, the daily maintenance of a family's standing with the gods who protected its threshold, its stores, its children, and its dead, was women's work, full stop, and it was taken with total seriousness. Small shrines dotted the house, a niche in a wall, a modest altar in the courtyard, sometimes just a designated spot where offerings could be left. Zeus Catasios, guardian of household property and stored goods, might be honored with a small jar kept specifically for him near the storeroom, periodically filled with a mixture of foods as an offering to ensure the household's wealth stayed protected. Zeus Hercaeus watched over the courtyard enclosure itself. Apollo Agius, in some households, was represented by a simple stone pillar near the front door, honored to protect the threshold from harm before anyone crossed it. Each of these small, ongoing rituals, a pinch of incense here, a few drops of wine poured out there, a murmured prayer while kneading dough or banking the fire for the night, fell to the women of the house to remember, to perform correctly, and to keep consistent, because ritual in the Greek world worked on the logic that correct repetition mattered more than grand gesture. The gods noticed lapses. Consider what this meant for your daily rhythm. Before meals, a small portion might be set aside or a few drops poured out in libation before anyone touched the food themselves. Before a journey, before a birth, before an illness took a turn for better or worse, prayers were offered at the household shrine, often by the woman of the house on behalf of everyone under her roof. This wasn't separate from the practical labor of running a household. It was woven directly through it, inseparable from the work of feeding, healing, and protecting a family. The distinction modern audiences might draw between chores and worship barely existed for a Greek woman managing her home. Grinding the grain and honoring Demeter, goddess of the harvest that made the grain possible in the first place, were part of a single continuous act of care. There's also something quietly striking about how much trust this arrangement required from men who, in nearly every other domain, insisted on controlling women's access to public and religious authority. The gods of the household were not minor gods. Getting their worship wrong wasn't a small social faux pas. In a worldview where divine favor was believed to directly determine whether crops failed, whether children survived infancy, whether a husband returned safely from battle, the stakes of correct household ritual were about as high as stakes could get. And the people entrusted with managing those stakes every single day without direct male oversight of each individual act of worship, were women. Death, too, folded into this domestic religious world in ways almost entirely governed by women. When a family member died, it was the women of the household, wife, mother, sisters, sometimes hired professional mourners, who washed and anointed the body, dressed it, and arranged it for the laying out period before burial, a ritual role we'll return to later tonight. The threshold between the living household and the realm of the dead was, quite literally, tended by women's hands. And beyond the walls of any single house, the same domestic religious authority scaled outward into something remarkable, an entire calendar of festivals, some of the most important in the Athenian religious year, that were run by women, for women, with men legally and formally excluded. We'll spend real time with those festivals shortly, because they deserve it. But it's worth planting the idea here at the household shrine, with the incense smoke curling up past a small stone image of Zeus Ctesios. The same women trusted to manage a family's ongoing relationship with the gods inside their own home were also, collectively, trusted to manage some of the city's most sacred and consequential religious rites, rites that Athenian men, for all their political power, were simply not permitted to witness. It's a strange kind of power, almost entirely invisible from the outside, almost entirely uncontested from within, and almost completely absent from the version of ancient Greece that gets taught in a single afternoon of a history class, where the gods belong to temples and priests and grand civic processions, and no one thinks to mention the quiet daily devotion happening at a small hearth shrine, tended by a woman whose name history never bothered to record. Take a moment here, if you're still with us, still awake enough to think. So much of what we've walked through tonight has been about the gap between how a life looks from the outside and what's actually happening within it. A house that looks silent and closed from the street and turns out to be running an entire economy behind its walls. It's worth wondering, quietly, how much of anyone's life works that way. How much of what looks small or invisible from the outside is actually holding everything else up. If you're still listening and you feel like it, let us know in the comments what you think a stranger would never guess about your own daily life just from looking at your front door. Then let your eyes close again and let's keep going, because the house is about to open its door just once a year to a festival no man in the city was ever allowed to see. Once a year, for 3 days in the autumn, the ordinary rules of Athenian life quietly inverted themselves. Citizen wives left their houses, not quietly, not apologetically, but as a matter of civic obligation, and gathered on a hill just outside the city for a festival called the Thesmophoria. And for those 3 days, every adult male citizen of Athens, from the wealthiest aristocrat to the lowest laborer, was legally barred from attending, from watching, and in some accounts, even from approaching the site at all. Try to feel the strangeness of that for a moment, set against everything we've talked about tonight. This was a city that built its domestic architecture specifically to keep women out of public view, that restricted their movement, their speech, their legal standing, their access to political life, and that same city, once a year, handed an enormous religious festival entirely over to women with no male oversight whatsoever, and treated it as one of the most important events on the civic religious calendar. The Thesmophoria honored Demeter, goddess of grain and the harvest, and her daughter Persephone, whose descent into and return from the underworld each year was believed to govern the cycle of the seasons. Only married citizen women could take part, a detail that mattered enormously because it meant the festival was, among other things, an assertion of who truly belonged to the citizen body of Athens, tied directly to legitimate marriage and legitimate children. Slaves and unmarried women were excluded. This wasn't a festival about womanhood in some broad universal sense. It was specifically about the reproductive and civic role of the citizen wife, the same woman who spent most of the year invisible inside her own house, was for these 3 days publicly and collectively essential to the entire city's relationship with the gods who controlled its food supply. What actually happened during those 3 days is only partially recorded, in part because the rites were considered so sacred that revealing their details to outsiders, meaning specifically to men, was treated as a serious transgression. But enough survives, pieced together from later writers, from comic plays that gently mocked the festival, and from archaeological evidence at festival sites to sketch its outline. Women camped together on the festival grounds in temporary shelters, sleeping away from their husbands and households entirely. For the first time, most of them had experienced in years, possibly ever. There was fasting, mourning, and ritual obscenity, a practice called iskrologia, involving crude, sexually explicit joking and language among the women themselves, believed to honor an old myth in which a servant girl's ribald joke was the only thing that could make the grieving Demeter laugh again after losing her daughter. There was also, in the most striking part of the rite, a practice involving piglets. In the months before the festival, live piglets were thrown into deep pits or underground chambers as sacrifices left to decompose. During the Thesmophoria itself, women known as bailers descended into these pits, a task considered ritually dangerous, associated with snakes believed to guard the remains, to retrieve the decayed remnants, which were then mixed with seed grain and scattered over the fields in a rite meant to ensure the coming harvest's fertility. It's visceral, unglamorous, physically demanding religious labor, performed entirely by women for the benefit of the entire city's food supply, and virtually unknown to most people's mental picture of ancient Greece. Think about what that means for how you should picture these women. Not passive, not decorative, descending into pits in the dark to retrieve decomposing offerings because the harvest depended on it, and doing so as a matter of civic duty on behalf of every household in Athens, including the households of men who would never be allowed anywhere near the ritual, and if the sources are to be believed, generally didn't ask too many questions about what their wives got up to during those 3 autumn days. The Thesmophoria wasn't the only festival women controlled. There was also the Adonia, a much more informal, much more personal rite mourning the death of Adonis, the beautiful young mortal loved by Aphrodite, killed young by a wild boar. Unlike the highly structured, civically sanctioned Thesmophoria, the Adonia had a looser, almost rebellious energy. Women climbed onto the flat rooftops of their houses, carrying small pots planted with fast-growing seeds, lettuce, fennel, quick greens sown specifically because they would sprout rapidly and just as rapidly wither in the summer heat, a living metaphor for a beautiful life cut painfully short. These gardens of Adonis were set out in the sun, watered obsessively for a few days, and then allowed to die, at which point the withered plants were thrown into the sea or a river, accompanied by loud public mourning, wailing, breast beating, the kind of unrestrained emotional display that was frowned upon or tightly controlled in almost every other public context available to Greek women. The comic playwright Aristophanes has one of his characters complain, half jokingly, about being unable to sleep because of the racket women were making on the rooftops during an Adonia festival, mourning loudly enough to be heard through the whole neighborhood. It's a small detail, tossed off for a laugh in a play written for a male audience, and yet it tells you something real, that once a year, women's collective grief, ordinarily expected to be modest and restrained, was permitted, even expected, to be loud enough to disturb an entire city's sleep, and there was apparently nothing anyone could, or particularly wanted to, do about it. What's worth carrying forward from both of these festivals, as strange and specific as their details are, is the underlying pattern. Athenian religious life didn't just tolerate women's exclusive gatherings, it depended on them. The city genuinely believed, as a matter of religious conviction, that the harvest itself required rites only women could correctly perform, and that certain forms of grief could only be properly expressed by women in spaces men were required to leave alone. For 3 days every autumn, and for a handful of days every summer during the Adonia, the invisible women of Athens became the entire city's spiritual center of gravity, and every man who had spent the rest of the year insisting on their confinement and silence had no choice but to wait outside and trust that whatever was happening beyond his sight was being handled correctly. Imagine being 14 years old and being told that this year you will leave the only house you've ever known and move into the house of a man you have possibly never spoken to and possibly never even seen. This wasn't unusual. It was, for a citizen girl in classical Athens, close to the norm. Marriages were arranged, almost always by the bride's father or closest male guardian, frequently to a man in his late 20s or 30s, a gap of 10, 15, sometimes 20 years between bride and groom. The logic behind the age gap was practical rather than romantic. A man was expected to have completed his military service and established some economic footing before taking on a household, while a girl was considered ready for marriage as soon as she reached physical maturity, since her primary value to the arrangement, at least in the eyes of the law, was her ability to produce legitimate heirs. The decision itself had almost nothing to do with you. A marriage was, first and foremost, a contract between two households, negotiated by men, sealed with a dowry, property, money, or goods that the bride's family transferred to the marriage, technically remaining hers in the sense that it would return to her or her family if the marriage ended, but managed entirely by her husband for as long as the marriage lasted. The size of that dowry mattered enormously, not just for the material comfort it might buy, but because it affected a wife's standing and leverage within her new household. A larger dowry meant a woman married into a family that had more to lose if they mistreated her, and more incentive to keep her satisfied enough that her family wouldn't intervene. The wedding itself unfolded across several days, thick with ritual, each step designed to mark the transition from one household's daughter to another household's wife. There was a ritual bath using water carried specifically from a designated spring in Athens from a fountain house associated with the rite, believed to purify the bride before the marriage. There was a wedding feast at the bride's family home, and then, as night fell, a torchlit procession, the bride carried or led by cart or on foot from her father's house to her husband's, accompanied by wedding songs, torches held aloft against the darkness, friends and family calling out blessings, and often deliberately bawdy jokes meant to ease the tension of what was, for a very young bride, a genuinely frightening transition. At the threshold of her new home, her mother in law would greet her, and a specific ritual played out. The bride was showered with dried fruit, nuts, and figs, a gesture meant to invoke abundance and fertility for the household she was now joining. Only then did she cross the threshold, and, in a detail that captures the whole emotional architecture of the day, she was often required to be carried across it rather than walk, a physical enactment of the idea that she was not choosing this new life by her own steps, but being brought into it. Once inside, she was led to the household hearth and presented formally to the family's ancestral gods in a rite that marked her official incorporation into her husband's family's religious life, the same domestic religious world we spent time with earlier tonight. From that moment, she belonged, ritually and legally, to a different household than the one she'd been raised in, under the authority of a man she may have met for the very first time only days before. It's worth being honest about how disorienting this must have been, without romanticizing it and without flattening it into pure tragedy either. Sources from the period do occasionally hint at real affection developing between husbands and wives. Funerary inscriptions sometimes describe genuine grief and tenderness, and Xenophon's household guide includes moments that read less like a legal manual and more like a young husband genuinely trying, however clumsily, to make his new wife feel capable and valued in her new role. But the starting point of almost every citizen marriage was an arrangement made without the bride's consent between men who were often thinking primarily about property, alliance, and legitimate heirs, and a girl who had no legal standing to object. Legal standing is, in fact, the right phrase to focus on because it explains so much of what came next in a wife's life. An Athenian woman, married or not, never achieved full legal independence in the way an adult male citizen did. She remained, for her entire life, under the guardianship, the kyria, of a male relative, her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and if widowed, her son, or another male relative, or occasionally her father again. She could not, on her own legal authority, buy or sell significant property, enter into major contracts, or represent herself in court. Any legal matter of real consequence had to be conducted through her guardian, regardless of her own judgment, competence, or wishes in the matter. And yet, and this is the detail worth sitting with, because it echoes everything we've already seen tonight, within the household that legal framework theoretically subordinated her to, the actual day-to-day authority frequently ran the other way. The husband held legal guardianship. The wife held operational control. He could, on paper, make almost any decision about the household's property. In practice, he very often had no idea how much oil was left in the storeroom, what state the year's cloth production was in, or which slave needed to be reassigned to cover for another who'd fallen ill, because that knowledge, that judgment, that day to day command belonged to her, and everyone in the household, including him, generally understood that trying to run it without her would be a disaster. Marriage, in other words, delivered a Greek woman into a legal condition of permanent minority and simultaneously handed her the practical command of an entire household's survival. Both things were true at once for her entire adult life, and neither one canceled the other out. Everything we've explored so far tonight has centered on one particular kind of woman, the citizen's wife, secluded, respectable, her name unspoken, her labor invisible but essential. It's easy, telling the story this way, to accidentally suggest that this was simply what it meant to be a woman in ancient Greece. It wasn't. It was one path among several, and the other paths looked almost nothing alike. Step into the andron of a wealthy Athenian household on an evening when the men are entertaining, and you would find a very different kind of woman present entirely, not the wife of the house, who remained upstairs in the gyneconitis, but a hetaira, a professional female companion, present specifically because she was permitted to do everything a citizen wife was not: appear at a men's drinking party, converse freely with guests, play music, engage in witty conversation, drink wine alongside the men rather than being served separately, and generally occupy exactly the kind of visible, public, mixed gender social space that would have destroyed a citizen wife's reputation and her family's standing along with it. The word hetaira literally means companion, and it covered a wide range of circumstances, from women running something close to independent, high status social and sexual arrangements with wealthy or influential men, down to considerably less glamorous and more coerced situations. Some of the most famous hetairai in Athenian history achieved a level of public recognition no citizen wife could ever have hoped for. Aspasia, the partner of the statesman Pericles, was reportedly known throughout Athens for her intelligence and rhetorical skill, discussed by philosophers, mentioned by name in comic plays, credited by some ancient sources, likely with real exaggeration, with helping shape Pericles' own speeches. No citizen wife in Athens achieved that kind of public visibility for anything, let alone for her intellect, and the contrast tells you something important. The very same city that enforced strict silence and invisibility on respectable married women simultaneously created a separate social category of women who were permitted, even celebrated, for being exactly the opposite: clever, visible, vocal, and present in rooms citizen wives would never be allowed to enter. This wasn't liberation, and it's worth being honest about that rather than romanticizing it. A hetera's social and financial security depended entirely on the ongoing interest and generosity of the men who supported her, with none of the legal protections, however limited, that marriage and dowry offered a citizen wife. Many hetairai began as enslaved women, purchased and trained specifically for this role, or were foreign born women without citizen status, since the entire arrangement existed largely outside the legal categories that governed citizen marriage. Old age, illness, or simply falling out of fashion could end a hetera's livelihood with none of the safety net, however modest, that a citizen wife's household and dowry provided her. Below the hetera on this same social spectrum were women working in far less glamorous circumstances in and around the brothels of Athens, frequently enslaved, with essentially no control over their own circumstances at all. A grim, largely undocumented layer of this history that ancient sources mention mostly in passing, more concerned with regulating and taxing the trade than with the women's own experience of it. And then there was an enormous, often overlooked category of women who fit neither the secluded citizen wife nor the visible hetera, the working women of the agora and the streets, who make up, by any reasonable estimate, the largest group of adult women in the entire city, and the group our sources talk about the least, because philosophers and playwrights simply weren't very interested in them. These were women like the ones vividly, if unsympathetically, mocked in Athenian comedy. The vegetable seller haggling loudly over the price of her produce, the woman selling ribbons or garlands in a market stall, the wet nurse hired out by a poorer family to earn income by nursing a wealthier household's infant, alongside, or sometimes instead of, her own child. Aristophanes' plays are full of these women, mocked for their sharp tongues and market stall haggling. Again, comedy that only lands if the audience recognizes exactly the woman being described, which tells us these figures were an ordinary, unremarkable part of daily Athenian street life, however little formal history bothered to record about them individually. There were also skilled working women occupying a strange middle ground of respectability, professional wet nurses, hired specifically for their milk and their experience, sometimes commanding real bargaining power if their reputation for a healthy, thriving nursling was strong enough. Midwives, whose expertise we spent real time with earlier tonight, operating as respected specialists, even though their work took them constantly in and out of other people's households. Technically, the kind of public movement a strictly secluded ideal would have frowned upon. And women working as professional mourners, hired for their skill at ritual lamentation, moving from household to household, funeral to funeral, paid specifically to perform a kind of controlled, expert grief. What ties all of these women together, the celebrated hetaira, the anonymous vegetable seller, the traveling midwife, is that none of them fit the ideal we spent the first half of tonight exploring, and all of them, in their own way, expose how much that ideal of total female seclusion was really a wealthy citizen fantasy, rather than a description of how most women in Athens actually spent their days. Seclusion required a household wealthy enough to have slaves running the errands a secluded wife couldn't run herself. Most households weren't. For the vast majority of Athenian women, the philosophical ideal of the silent, invisible wife was something to aspire to, something that marked genuine status precisely because it was unattainable for most people, not a universal reality, but a luxury good, as scarce and prized as fine imported perfume or a large dowry, and just as far out of reach for most of the women actually filling the streets, markets, and workshops of the city every single day. Of everything a Greek woman was expected to do in her lifetime, nothing carried higher stakes or greater danger than childbirth. It's difficult, from where we sit now, to fully register how dangerous pregnancy and delivery genuinely were in the ancient world. Without modern medicine, without a real understanding of infection, Without safe methods to manage complications, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of childbearing age across the entire ancient Mediterranean. Athenian grave inscriptions bear this out with quiet, aching regularity. Young women, sometimes barely out of girlhood themselves, commemorated alongside references to childbirth, their gravestones sometimes depicting them still holding an infant, a detail that tells its own sorrowful story without needing to spell it out further. And yet, this was also, almost entirely, a world women managed for themselves, with remarkably little male involvement. Male physicians existed in ancient Greece, and the medical writings attributed to Hippocrates and his followers do discuss childbirth and women's reproductive health at some length. But the actual work of managing a pregnancy day to day and the actual work of delivering a baby belonged almost exclusively to midwives, women, often older women, who had given birth themselves, whose knowledge was passed down not through formal medical training, but through apprenticeship, observation, and the accumulated experience of having helped bring many children into the world. A midwife's knowledge covered remarkable ground for a body of expertise that was rarely written down in any systematic way. She would have understood how to judge the progress of labor, how to help position a laboring woman, how to manage the physical process of delivery, and, in the difficult cases every midwife eventually faced, how to try to save a mother, a child, or ideally both when something went wrong. Herbal knowledge ran alongside this practical experience. Certain plants were used to try to ease labor pains, others to try to stop dangerous bleeding after birth, others still believed to help expel a placenta that wasn't delivering cleanly on its own. Much of this knowledge doesn't survive in detail because it was never written down by the women who held it. It lived in memory, hand to hand, generation to generation, in a tradition almost entirely oral and almost entirely invisible to the historical record. The birth itself typically happened at home, in the women's quarters, attended by the midwife and by other women of the household and neighborhood, a genuinely communal event, even as it unfolded inside the private, secluded space of the house. Men were, as a rule, kept away entirely. This wasn't incidental. It reflected the same deep pattern running through so much of what we've already covered tonight. Certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of crisis, certain kinds of care belonged entirely to women, managed entirely by women, with men waiting outside, sometimes literally standing in another room of their own house, unable to do anything but wait for news. There were rituals woven through this process, too, echoing the household religion we spent time with earlier. Prayers to Artemis, goddess associated with both childbirth and, painfully, with the deaths of women in childbirth, were common before and during labor. After a successful birth, a wreath of olive leaves might be hung on the front door of the house to announce the arrival of a boy, or a strip of wool for a girl, a small public signal, visible from the street, of an event that had unfolded entirely out of public view. The period immediately after birth carried its own weight, and it's worth handling this part gently because it touches one of the harder truths of the ancient world. A newborn's survival was never guaranteed, and a family's decision about whether to raise a child, particularly in difficult economic circumstances, or when a child was born with visible illness or disability, was a real and recognized part of ancient Greek life, generally understood to rest with the father's authority rather than the mother's. It's a painful thread in this history, one that reflects how differently this world understood infancy and family obligation than we do now, and it sat quietly as one more form of loss and grief that fell disproportionately on the woman who had carried and delivered the child, often with very little say in what happened next. For those infants who were kept and raised, the earliest days of life folded straight back into the household rhythms we've already spent so much time with. A wet nurse, sometimes the mother herself, sometimes in wealthier households, an enslaved or hired woman specifically for the task, took on the daily labor of feeding and soothing the infant, while the household's older women passed down another layer of practical oral knowledge: how to bathe a newborn, how to swaddle it, which cries meant hunger and which meant something else, which herbal preparations might ease an infant's fever or colic. None of this was written in medical texts consulted by anyone in the house. It lived again in the accumulated memory of women who had done this work, or watched it done many times before. There's something worth holding on to here as we move forward tonight. So much of what made ancient Greek society function, its food supply, secured through the thesmophoria, its textile wealth, produced at the loom, its households, run from the storeroom key, and now, quite literally, its next generation, brought into the world through the hands and accumulated knowledge of midwives, depended on expertise that belonged almost entirely to women, was passed down almost entirely outside any formal, recorded system, and left almost no trace in the historical record beyond a scattering of grave inscriptions, a handful of medical texts written by men observing from a distance, and the simple, undeniable fact that the population of the ancient Greek world continued generation after generation to survive and grow. Long before modern medicine had any real understanding of human anatomy, Greek physicians had already developed detailed, confident theories about how a woman's body worked, theories that were, by turns, strangely perceptive, and to modern ears, almost unbelievable. And because these ideas shaped how women themselves were treated, diagnosed, and understood within their own households, they're worth spending real time with tonight. The dominant medical framework of the classical Greek world was humoral theory, the belief that the body was governed by a balance of four fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance among them. Illness meant one humor had grown excessive or deficient relative to the others. This framework applied to men and women alike, but the Hippocratic medical writers, the school of physicians whose surviving texts shaped Greek medical thinking for centuries, believed women's bodies operated under a distinctly different set of rules, built around a single organizing idea: the womb. The most famous and strangest of these ideas is what later became known as the wandering womb. Hippocratic writers believed the uterus was not a fixed organ, but something closer to a semi-independent creature within the body, capable of moving from its proper position, drying out or growing restless if deprived of regular intercourse and childbearing, and drifting upward through the body in search of moisture, pressing against other organs as it traveled: the liver, the diaphragm, even, in the most extreme formulations, rising as high as the throat, believed to cause choking sensations, difficulty breathing, and a whole constellation of symptoms modern medicine would recognize as entirely unrelated conditions, from anxiety to epilepsy to ordinary chest pain. This is, quite literally, the origin of the word hysteria, from hystera, the Greek word for womb, a term that would go on to have an extraordinarily long and troubling afterlife in Western medicine, used for well over 2,000 years afterward, right into the modern era, to describe a bewildering range of symptoms in women, almost always attributed to some dysfunction of the reproductive organs rather than to any cause that might also apply equally to men. The prescribed treatment for a wandering womb in the ancient Greek world was often marriage and regular intercourse if the patient was unmarried, or pregnancy if she was married but childless. A cure that reveals with real clarity how completely ancient Greek medicine understood a woman's health as inseparable from her reproductive function, and how little space existed in this framework for a woman's body to simply be unwell in a way unrelated to childbearing at all. Menstruation received similarly intense theoretical attention. Hippocratic writers understood it as a necessary monthly release of excess blood that, left unreleased, would build up dangerously within the body and cause illness, a theory that led physicians to treat delayed or absent menstrual periods as a serious medical concern requiring intervention, sometimes including remedies meant to induce bleeding. Virginity itself was treated with real medical suspicion in some Hippocratic texts, which describe unmarried young women as being at particular risk of a range of ailments, precisely because they had not yet begun regular sexual activity and childbearing, which Greek medicine considered the natural healthy state toward which a woman's body was oriented from puberty onward. Marriage, in other words, wasn't just a social and legal transition. In the medical thinking of the period, it was treated as something close to a required treatment for the ordinary condition of being a young woman. It's tempting to read all of this simply as evidence of how little ancient physicians actually understood about female anatomy, and that's certainly part of the truth. But it's worth noting something else, too. However flawed the underlying theory, Hippocratic medical writers did take women's specific physical complaints seriously enough to write about them at length across multiple treatises specifically devoted to women's diseases, a level of dedicated medical attention to female health that later periods of Western history, ironically, sometimes failed to match. The problem wasn't a lack of interest, it was a framework that filtered every symptom a woman reported through the single lens of her reproductive organs, whatever she was actually experiencing. Alongside this formal, male authored medical tradition ran the much older, largely oral tradition of women's own practical health knowledge, the herbal remedies, the accumulated observational wisdom passed between midwives and mothers and daughters that we touched on earlier tonight in the context of childbirth. This body of knowledge, unlike the Hippocratic texts, rarely got written down by the women who actually held it, but it clearly existed and clearly operated somewhat independently of formal medical theory. Women managed their own menstrual cycles, their own pregnancies, their own recovery from childbirth, using techniques and herbal preparations that had nothing to do with wandering wombs or humoral balance, refined instead through generations of direct, practical experience. There's a meaningful gap, worth acknowledging honestly, between what male physicians wrote about women's bodies and what women themselves likely believed and practiced day to day. A woman managing her own household's health, including her own, was drawing on an oral tradition of practical remedies. This herb for cramping, that preparation for a difficult recovery after birth, a particular treatment passed down from her own mother for an irregular cycle that operated in parallel with, and sometimes in real tension with, the formal medical theories being debated by men who, in the vast majority of cases, would never have direct, hands on experience of a menstrual period, a pregnancy, or a birth in their entire lives. Contraception and pregnancy prevention, too, occupied this same shadowy, women managed space. Ancient sources, including some Hippocratic texts, reference various herbal preparations believed to prevent or end early pregnancy. Silphium, a now extinct plant, once so prized for exactly this purpose that it appeared on coins from the North African city where it grew, along with pennyroyal and other plants understood to have this effect. How reliably these actually worked, medically speaking, is difficult to establish with real confidence from a modern vantage point, and effectiveness surely varied enormously. But their consistent presence across multiple ancient sources tells us something important. Family size and pregnancy timing weren't left entirely to chance or entirely to men's decisions, even in a world with no reliable modern medicine. Women pursued whatever means of control over their own reproductive lives that they could access quietly through exactly the same oral, women to women knowledge network that shaped so much of the rest of the world we've spent tonight exploring. So picture, one more time, that same household we opened with tonight, the blank wall, the closed door, and picture, somewhere behind it, two entirely different bodies of knowledge about a woman's own health operating side by side. One belonged to educated men, confident, theoretical, occasionally strange to modern ears, filtered entirely through the idea of the womb as the center of a woman's entire physical existence. The other belonged to women themselves, practical, largely unwritten, passed hand to hand across generations, managing the real, lived experience of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth with whatever tools an ancient world could offer, two parallel understandings of the same body, only one of which anyone thought, at the time, was worth writing down. For a woman whose entire upbringing revolved around the principle that she should be seen as rarely as possible, an enormous amount of care went into what happened on the occasions she was seen at all. Start with the most basic ritual, bathing. Greek houses of this period generally lacked anything like a private, running water bath the way we'd picture one today. Bathing happened using water heated over the household fire, poured into a large basin or portable tub, often a communal affair among the women of the household rather than a solitary one. Olive oil, rather than soap as we understand it, was the primary tool for cleaning the skin, rubbed on, then scraped away with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, taking dirt and sweat with it, a method used by everyone in Greek society, male and female alike, from athletes at the gymnasium to women at home. After bathing came the layer of ritual that tends to surprise people most. An entire cosmetic culture, sophisticated and specific, existed inside these secluded households, refined by women largely for the eyes of other women, since a citizen wife's opportunities to be seen by anyone outside her own family were genuinely limited. Pale skin was prized as a marker of status, visible proof that a woman spent her time indoors, supervising a household, rather than laboring outdoors under the sun, the way poorer women and slaves often had to. To achieve and maintain that pallor, women used a whitening powder made from white lead, applied to the face and sometimes the arms and chest. It's worth pausing on this one because it's a detail that undercuts any temptation to romanticize ancient beauty standards as somehow gentler or more natural than modern ones. Lead based cosmetics were, as we now know with total certainty, toxic, causing skin damage and, with regular long term use, much more serious harm. Women in this world were quite literally and quite unknowingly poisoning themselves in pursuit of a beauty standard built around looking as though they never left the house. Alongside the whitening powder came rouge, often made from crushed mulberries, alkanay root, or other plant based pigments, applied to the cheeks and lips to offset the deliberate pallor with a flush of color. Kohl, made from soot or from powdered minerals, darkened and defined the eyes. Eyebrows were sometimes darkened, and even in a detail that shows up repeatedly enough in ancient sources to be considered a real trend rather than an isolated eccentricity, deliberately extended toward the bridge of the nose to create the appearance of a single, unbroken brow, a look that strikes modern audiences as strange and would have struck an ancient Greek audience as genuinely fashionable. Hair received enormous, painstaking attention. Long hair was the standard for citizen women, typically bound up and elaborately arranged rather than left loose, since loose, unbound hair carried strong associations with mourning, ritual frenzy, or a lack of the self control a respectable woman was expected to project. Styles ranged from simple knots to complex arrangements involving braiding, pinning, and decorative bands or nets, sometimes woven through with ribbons or, for wealthier women, gold ornaments. Perfumed oils were worked through the hair and skin, made from a base of olive oil infused with flowers, herbs, and imported aromatics, rose, iris, myrrh, a genuine luxury industry that operated specifically to supply households with the means to smell as carefully composed as they looked. Clothing followed the same underlying logic: modesty in cut, but real sophistication in execution. The basic garment for a Greek woman was the peplos, or somewhat later, and more commonly, the chiton, a rectangle of woven cloth pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist, its folds and draping adjusted to flatter the wearer's figure within the bounds of what was considered decent. Over this, a himation, a larger wrapped cloak, could be draped in different configurations, sometimes pulled up over the head, particularly when a woman ventured outside her home, both as practical protection from sun and weather and as an additional layer of visual modesty. Color, pattern, and the fineness of the weave all signaled status. A finely woven, brightly dyed garment, produced from the same laborious wool-working process we spent real time with earlier tonight, announced a household's wealth as clearly as any spoken introduction could, which means that every time a woman appeared at a wedding, a funeral, or a festival, she was in a very real sense wearing the visible proof of her own months of labor at the loom. Jewelry, for those who could afford it, added another layer entirely. Earrings, necklaces, bracelets, and elaborate hairpins worked in gold and silver, some surviving today in remarkable condition, recovered from graves where they were buried alongside the women who wore them. These pieces weren't merely decorative. Like the dowry itself, jewelry functioned as a form of portable, personal wealth, property a woman could, in some circumstances, claim more directly as her own than almost anything else she owned, since it traveled with her rather than remaining tied to the household's shared stores. What's worth sitting with as we close out this part of the night is the sheer amount of skill, time, and cultivated knowledge that went into all of this. The mixing of pigments, the styling of hair, the blending of perfumed oils, the draping of cloth to flatter rather than merely cover, for an audience that for most citizen wives consisted almost entirely of other women and of the small circle of male relatives who saw her daily at home. This wasn't beauty performed for the male gaze of the wider city, because the wider city, by design, rarely got the chance to look. It was beauty refined and maintained largely within a private, female dominated social world, for the fountain house, for the women only festivals, for the scrutiny and admiration of mothers in law, sisters, and friends, a fully developed aesthetic culture, flourishing almost entirely behind the same blank courtyard walls that kept the rest of the city from ever fully knowing it existed. Ask what a citizen girl's formal education looked like in classical Athens, and the honest answer is unsettling in its brevity. For most of them, there wasn't one. Boys of citizen families, at least those whose households could afford it, attended lessons with a grammatistus to learn reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, studied poetry and music, and trained physically at the gymnasium, all in preparation for the public life of the citizen assembly, the law courts, and eventually often military command. A girl's education, by contrast, happened almost entirely at home, taught not by hired tutors, but by her mother and the older women of the household, and it focused overwhelmingly on the skills we've already spent hours with tonight: spinning, weaving, household management, religious observance, the accumulated practical knowledge that would let her run a home of her own. Formal literacy, in particular, appears to have been genuinely rare among Athenian citizen women, though historians debate exactly how rare, since the evidence is frustratingly thin. Vase paintings occasionally show women reading from scrolls or holding writing tablets, which suggests literacy wasn't considered unthinkable or scandalous for a woman to possess. But these images are far outnumbered by scenes of women at the loom, and the balance of evidence suggests that whatever literacy existed among citizen women was inconsistent, largely a matter of individual family practice, rather than any expectation the wider city held for girls the way it did for boys. It's worth sitting with what that actually meant in practice. A woman who couldn't read couldn't consult a medical text if her child fell ill. She relied entirely on the oral, hands on knowledge passed down from other women, the kind we discussed in the section on childbirth and midwifery. She couldn't read a law, a contract, or a public inscription for herself, which meant that even in the rare circumstances where a legal matter touched her directly, she depended on a father, husband, or son to explain and represent it to her. Her entire intellectual world, in other words, was built on oral transmission, memory, conversation, observation, apprenticeship, passed from woman to woman, largely undocumented because the women passing it down had no reliable way to write it down, even if they'd wanted to, and little cultural expectation that they should. Against this backdrop, it's worth understanding just how extraordinary it was that one woman from this world became one of the most celebrated poets in all of Greek antiquity, read, quoted, and admired by men for centuries after her death. Sappho lived on the island of Lesbos, not in Athens, sometime around the turn of the 7th to 6th century BCE, earlier than most of what we've discussed tonight, and in a different, somewhat less restrictive social world than classical Athens would later become. She came from an aristocratic family, wealthy enough to afford her both education and the freedom to write. Her poetry, composed to be performed with music, addressed love, longing, female friendship, and desire, the beauty of the natural world, and the private emotional textures of women's lives, with an intimacy and technical sophistication that later Greek critics, writing in a culture that rarely credited women with intellectual achievement of any kind, felt compelled to call her simply the poetess, as though no further clarification were needed, the female counterpart to Homer himself. Only fragments of Sappho's work survive today, most of them damaged, torn papyrus preserving a phrase or a few lines out of what were once complete poems, a loss that is its own kind of quiet tragedy. A woman who somehow broke through nearly every barrier standing between an ancient Greek woman and lasting literary fame, and whose actual words have still mostly been lost to time, fire, and the simple grinding attrition of 2,500 years. What made Sappho possible when the rest of this story has been built around women whose names were barely recorded at all? Partly it was circumstance. Lesbos in her era wasn't Athens, and its aristocratic women appear to have enjoyed considerably more freedom of movement, association, and expression than the secluded ideal that later took hold in classical Athenian society. Partly it was class, real wealth, and the freedom that came with it opened doors that were simply never available to most women in the ancient Greek world, citizen or otherwise. And partly, frankly, it was luck. Sappho's poetry was skillful enough, distinctive enough, that even a culture generally uninterested in preserving women's intellectual work made an exception for her, copied her poems, taught them, quoted them, argued about them for centuries. But Sappho's fame should be read as the exception that proves the rule, not evidence that Greek women in general had real access to education, literacy, and public intellectual life. For every Sappho, there were thousands upon thousands of women whose minds were every bit as sharp, whose command of language and observation might have rivaled hers, and who left no trace at all because no one thought to teach them to write, and no one thought their unwritten words were worth remembering once they were gone. There's a particular kind of loss embedded in that fact, one worth sitting with as tonight's story continues. Everything we've reconstructed about Greek women's daily lives, the loom, the storeroom, the fountain house, the festivals, comes to us almost entirely through objects, through the writings of men observing from the outside, and through a small handful of surviving inscriptions. The interior world of these women, what they actually thought, what they found funny, what they feared, what they loved, survives, if it survives at all, mostly through implication, through the shape of an absence, rather than through their own recorded voice. Sappho is the rare exception who lets us hear something closer to a direct first person female voice from this ancient world. Multiply her by every literate woman whose name and words never survived at all, and you start to get some sense of just how much of this history was lost, not because these women had nothing worth saying, but because almost no one around them thought their words were worth writing down. Everything we've spent tonight exploring, the seclusion, the fountain house as escape valve, the loom as both cage and craft, describes life primarily in Athens, and Athens was not the whole of the Greek world. Travel roughly 130 miles southwest into the region of Laconia, and you'd find a city whose approach to its women was so different that other Greeks found it genuinely shocking and said so repeatedly in writing. That city was Sparta, and the differences started before a girl was even old enough to understand what made her upbringing unusual. Where an Athenian girl's education, such as it was, focused almost entirely on domestic skills learned at her mother's side, woolworking, household management, the practical knowledge that would prepare her to run a home of her own. A Spartan girl was raised under a state mandated system of physical training. Spartan girls ran, wrestled, threw javelins, and competed in athletic contests, some of it performed in remarkably little clothing by the standards of the rest of the Greek world, a practice other Greeks found scandalous enough to comment on with real disapproval. The reasoning behind this wasn't a Spartan belief in gender equality, as we might understand the concept today. It was rooted in eugenics and military necessity. Sparta's entire social structure existed to produce and sustain its warrior class, and Spartan authorities believed, quite explicitly, that physically strong, healthy women would produce physically strong, healthy sons. The gap widened further in adulthood, where an Athenian citizen's wife was, by law and custom, kept apart from the working of land and largely confined to household management. Spartan women managed real property directly and managed a great deal of it. Because Spartan men were required to live communally and focus almost entirely on military training from childhood through much of their adult lives, spending long stretches of time away from their own households in shared barracks, the actual running of Spartan estates, including agricultural land worked by an enslaved population known as helots, fell largely to Spartan women. By the 4th century BCE, according to the philosopher Aristotle, who found the whole arrangement alarming enough to write about it at length, and with obvious disapproval, Spartan women were believed to control something close to 2/5 of all the land in Spartan territory, either through inheritance or dowry, an extraordinary concentration of property in women's hands for the ancient world by any standard. Aristotle's discomfort is itself a useful historical document in its own way. Writing from an Athenian perspective, he criticized Spartan society for what he saw as excessive female influence, arguing that Spartan women had grown undisciplined, luxury loving, and disruptive to the city's military focus, precisely because they held so much unsupervised authority over property and household affairs while their husbands were occupied elsewhere. It's worth reading that criticism the way you'd read a hostile witness statement. Aristotle wasn't a neutral observer of Spartan women's lives, and his disapproval tells you as much about Athenian anxieties concerning female independence as it does about Sparta itself. But even accounting for his bias, the underlying facts he was reacting to appear to hold up. Spartan women really did control significant property, really did move more freely through public life and really were, by the standards of virtually every other Greek city, unusually visible and unusually independent. Marriage customs reflected this same divergence. Spartan women typically married somewhat later than their Athenian counterparts, closer to 18 than 14, a gap that mattered enormously for a young person's physical and emotional readiness for marriage and childbirth. Some ancient sources, most notably the historian Plutarch, writing centuries later, describe unusual Spartan marriage customs, including practices around wife sharing between men for the purposes of producing strong offspring for the state, framed as a further expression of Sparta's singular focus on producing the next generation of warriors above almost any other social consideration, including conventional ideas of marital exclusivity found elsewhere in the Greek world. Historians today treat some of these more sensational details with real caution, since Plutarch was writing long after the fact, drawing on a mix of earlier sources and Spartan mythology about itself. But the broader picture of a society organizing marriage and reproduction around state military needs, rather than around the household centered model followed in Athens, is well supported. Even Spartan women's voices survive differently than Athenian women's do. A number of pointed, often strikingly blunt sayings attributed to Spartan mothers were collected and circulated in antiquity, most famously the instruction reportedly given to sons heading off to battle, telling them to return carrying their shield or being carried upon it, meaning come home victorious or come home dead, but never come home having thrown your shield away in cowardly retreat. Whether every individual saying attributed to a Spartan mother is authentic or partly later invention, the fact that Spartan women were remembered and quoted and characterized as sharp tongued, publicly assertive figures at all stands, in real contrast to the near total silence surrounding individual Athenian wives, who rarely appear as quoted, named individuals in the surviving historical record at all. None of this means Spartan women lived free, equal lives by any modern measure. Their independence existed entirely in service of a rigid, militarized state that valued them chiefly for their capacity to produce and support warriors, and Spartan society placed its own brutal constraints on women, just as Athens did, only differently shaped. But holding Sparta and Athens side by side does something valuable for tonight's story. It proves that the seclusion, the silence, the confinement we've spent so much time exploring wasn't some universal, unavoidable feature of ancient Greek life. It was a choice, made differently by different cities, shaped by each city's particular priorities. Athens optimizing for household economy and civic reputation, Sparta optimizing for military production. And in both cases, women found ways to hold real, substantial authority within whatever structure they were handed, whether that structure hid them behind a courtyard wall or sent them out, javelin in hand, into the open Spartan sun. There is a strange kind of freedom that could arrive in ancient Greece only after decades of exactly the opposite. A freedom that came with age, and specifically with the end of a woman's childbearing years, when the anxieties that had shaped nearly every rule governing her movement and visibility finally began to loosen their grip. A young citizen wife's seclusion, as we've spent so much of tonight exploring, was tied directly to concerns about legitimate paternity and family honor, concerns that mattered most intensely while a woman was of childbearing age. her sexual reputation directly bound up with the legitimacy of the children she might produce. An older woman, past menopause, no longer carried quite the same weight of anxiety, and the historical record reflects this shift with real consistency. Older women appear more frequently in public roles across Greek society, as the priestesses required for certain cults, as the professional mourners hired to lead funeral lamentation, as midwives moving freely between households, as the female relatives permitted to accompany a funeral procession all the way to the grave when younger women's participation was curtailed. Age, in other words, functioned as a kind of earned pass, loosening restrictions that had governed a woman's entire younger adult life. This mattered enormously for the specific transition of widowhood, which was statistically an extremely common experience for women in this world. Given that citizen husbands were typically 10 to 15 years older than their wives to begin with, and given the constant grinding toll of warfare across the Greek city states, Athens alone was at war for a significant portion of nearly every decade during the classical period. A great many women could expect to outlive their husbands by a considerable stretch of years, sometimes decades. Widowhood placed a woman in a genuinely precarious legal position, precisely because of the guardianship system we discussed earlier tonight. A widow did not simply become independent upon her husband's death. Legal authority over her passed instead to another male relative, most commonly her adult son, if she had one old enough to take on the role, or otherwise to her father, a brother, or another designated guardian. If she had young children, she generally remained in her late husband's household, her son's inheritance, and her own position within that household now depending heavily on the goodwill of her husband's family, and eventually on her own son as he came of age and formally took over the household's affairs. Alternatively, a widow's birth family could reclaim her, along with her dowry, and arrange a second marriage, a real and fairly common outcome, particularly for younger widows without children, since a returned dowry represented genuine, attractive wealth to a new prospective husband and his family. Remarriage carried none of the stigma in ancient Greece that later periods sometimes attached to it. A widow of childbearing age marrying again was simply understood as a practical, unremarkable continuation of the same household economics that had governed her first marriage. For older widows, particularly those with adult sons already established in households of their own, life could look meaningfully different from the tightly circumscribed existence of a young bride. A mother who had successfully raised sons to adulthood, secured good marriages for her daughters, and managed her household competently through however many years of marriage had earned a specific, genuinely respected status within Greek social life. The position of mater familias, in fact, if not in exact title, deferred to by daughters-in-law who had married into her son's household, consulted on matters of household management and ritual observance by virtue of decades of accumulated, hard-won experience. The same storeroom key, the same command of domestic religious ritual, the same practical wisdom about woolworking, food storage, and childbirth that had defined her entire adult life now carried the added authority of age and proven competence, passed down instead of merely practiced. There was real vulnerability bound up in aging, too, and it would be dishonest to describe this transition as simply a steady climb toward greater freedom and respect. A widow without sons, without a supportive birth family, or without significant property of her own could find herself genuinely dependent on the charity or obligation of more distant relatives, her security resting entirely on other people's willingness to honor social expectations that carried moral weight but not always reliable legal enforcement. Old age without family support was a real danger in a world with no broader social safety net beyond the household, and in some cases, limited public provisions for citizens in genuine need. And there was grief layered onto grief for many older women in this world in a way that's easy to overlook. A woman who had spent decades performing the prothesis for others, washing and preparing the bodies of parents, perhaps a husband, perhaps given the very real dangers of infancy and childhood illness in the ancient world, one or more of her own children carried the accumulated weight of exactly the kind of ritual, hands on morning labor we spent time with earlier tonight, over and over across an entire lifetime, with no real expectation that anyone would extend her the same care in return until her own final illness whenever it came. What's worth holding on to as this part of the story closes is how much a Greek woman's entire life traced a long, quiet arc from near total restriction toward a hard earned, if never fully secure, authority, arriving as a stranger at 14 in a husband's house she hadn't chosen, and potentially ending her life decades later as the most senior, most respected woman in a household full of grandchildren, her early silence gradually replaced by the accumulated undeniable authority of having simply endured and managed and kept everyone fed and clothed and properly mourned for longer than almost anyone around her could fully appreciate. There is one more room this story needs to enter before we let it rest for the night, and it's the quietest one, the room where a body is laid out, washed, and prepared to leave the world of the living. In ancient Greece, that room, like so many others we've visited tonight, belonged to women. When a member of a household died, it was the women, a wife, a mother, daughters, sisters, sometimes assisted by female relatives from outside the immediate family, who performed the prothesis, the ritual laying out of the body. This involved washing the deceased, anointing the body with oil, dressing it in fine cloth, often specially woven for exactly this purpose, and arranging it on a bier within the house, feet pointed toward the door, so that family and neighbors could come and pay their respects before burial. Every part of this process required steady hands and a kind of practiced calm in the face of grief, developed the same way so much of women's expertise in this world developed, through repetition, through watching older women do it before you, through the quiet, unglamorous accumulation of experience that never made it into any philosopher's treatise. The laying out period typically lasted a single day, during which visitors came to view the body and offer condolences, and it was women, again, who were expected to lead the visible expression of grief. Ancient Greek mourning practice, particularly among women, involved loud lamentation, wailing, rhythmic cries, sometimes accompanied by tearing at one's hair or clothing, striking the chest, a controlled but genuinely intense outpouring of sound and physical grief that stands in sharp contrast to the quiet, restrained public demeanor expected of respectable women in almost every other context. Professional mourners, women hired specifically for their skill at this kind of ritual lamentation, sometimes joined family members for funerals that could afford them, their cries helping to lead and shape the emotional register of the whole household's grief. This was, in fact, a practice significant enough that Athenian lawmakers eventually stepped in to limit it. Solon's reforms, which we touched on earlier in the context of restricting women's movement to and from funerals, also placed limits on the scale and duration of funeral processions and on the intensity of public mourning displays, specifically targeting the kind of dramatic, loud, women led lamentation that had apparently grown elaborate and costly enough among wealthier families competing to stage the most impressive funeral that the city felt the need to intervene. It's a small detail that says a great deal. An entire area of Athenian law existed specifically because women's collective grief, left unregulated, was powerful enough, loud enough, and socially significant enough that men in government felt compelled to legislate its limits. After the laying out and the visitation, the body was carried in procession to its burial site, typically before dawn, torches lighting the way, much as they had lit a bride's procession to her new home, the same imagery of fire and threshold crossing, marking both the beginning and the end of a woman's life, and of the lives she had helped bring into the world. Women walked in this procession too, though by custom, older women, generally those past childbearing age or close relatives, were more likely to accompany the body all the way to the grave, while younger women's participation was more restricted, part of the broader pattern of controlling which women appeared in which public settings, even in grief. Burial itself, and the goods placed with the dead, often reflected a lifetime already described tonight in loving detail. Women's graves across the Greek world have yielded spindle whorls, loom weights, mirrors, cosmetic containers, jewelry, and the small clay perfume flasks called lekithoi, many painted with scenes of women at the loom, at the tomb, or preparing offerings, the same activities that filled their days now accompanying them into the earth. It's a quietly moving detail when you sit with it, the objects a woman used to run her household, to make herself beautiful for the small circle of people permitted to see her, to honor gods most of the wider world never watched her worship, were very often the same objects chosen to travel with her into death. And the duty of remembering didn't end at the grave. Women were responsible for tending family tombs long after the funeral itself, returning at regular intervals throughout the year, particularly during a set of specific commemorative days on the Athenian calendar, to pour libations, leave offerings of food and flowers, and maintain the physical upkeep of the grave marker itself. This ongoing care of the dead functioned as a kind of extension of the household religious duties we spent time with earlier tonight. One more thread in the enormous, largely uncelebrated web of religious and domestic labor that women held together year after year, generation after generation, almost entirely without recognition beyond their own family circle. There's a certain symmetry worth noticing as this part of the story closes. A Greek woman's life, from the ritual bath before her wedding to the ritual washing of her own body after death, was framed at both ends by acts of careful, practiced female labor, women preparing women for the two great thresholds of existence, the crossing into marriage and the crossing out of life itself. In between those two moments stretched everything else we've spent tonight exploring: the loom, the storeroom, The fountain house, the hearth, the festivals no man was permitted to witness. A life largely invisible to the wider world, and yet within its own boundaries, almost entirely full, tended, managed, mourned, and remembered by the very women history so rarely thought to name. If you've stayed with us this far, you're probably somewhere close to sleep by now, and that seems like the right place to leave this story. Somewhere quiet, somewhere close to rest, because rest is, in its own way, exactly what this whole night has been circling. Think back to where we started: a blank wall, a single door, a house that gave the street nothing at all. It would have been easy, and it would have been wrong to stop there, to look at that closed door and assume it meant absence, assume it meant a life with nothing much happening behind it. Instead, we walked through that door together and found a woman running a textile economy before sunrise, forecasting a household's food supply against the uncertainty of war and bad harvests, tending gods most of the city never thought to ask about, walking to a fountain house that functioned as her own private newsroom, descending into pits in the dark for the sake of next year's grain, and once a year, closing an entire city's men out of a hillside for 3 days, because some things, the Greeks believed, only women could be trusted to do correctly. None of this erases the real limits placed on her. She couldn't vote. She couldn't, in most cases, represent herself in a court of law. She was married young, often to a stranger, and answered for her entire adult life to a male guardian who held legal authority over decisions she may have understood far better than he did. Her name, more often than not, was never written down at all except on a gravestone, in relation to a father or a husband, with a wool basket carved beside her as the highest compliment anyone thought to give. But limitation and invisibility were never quite the same thing as absence, and that might be the truest thing this whole story has to offer. A woman confined to her house still ran that house completely. A woman excluded from politics still held collective, unquestioned authority over some of the city's most sacred religious rites. A woman whose name the historians barely bothered to record still, in her own lifetime, held the keys, sometimes literally, on a cord at her waist, to whether the people she loved ate well or went hungry, stayed warm or went cold, honored their gods correctly or didn't. 2,500 years later, almost none of her individual words survive. We don't know what she said at the fountain house, or what she prayed for at the hearth, or what she felt walking the torchlit path into a house full of strangers at 14 years old. All we have are the objects she left behind: the loom weights, the spindle whirls, the small painted flasks, and the outline of a life reconstructed from law codes written by men, comic plays written by men, philosophy written by men, all of them describing, sometimes admiringly, and sometimes with real anxiety, a world of women's work and women's authority they only partly understood and clearly never fully controlled. Let that be the last thought you carry into sleep tonight. Somewhere, 25 centuries ago, in the quiet hour before dawn, a woman was already awake, already at her loom, already running a life far larger and far more consequential than the blank wall of her house would ever let you guess. If you drifted off somewhere in the middle of this one, that's exactly what it was made for. You can always come back and pick up the thread another night. And if you're somehow still awake, thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of a night that's covered more ground than most people realize when they picture ancient Greece. If this kind of slow, immersive history helps you sleep, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making more of it. We'll see you in the next one. Rest easy, sleep well. This is Drowsy History.